On the way of Mexico, where the sun shines daily on the mountain top. I took a trip on a sailing ship. When I reached Jamaica, I made a stop. But I'm sad to say I'm on my way. I won't be back for many a days. My head is down, my head is turning around. I had to let everybody to them in Kingston town.
He was called Agwambo, the enigma, the man who would move mountains without ever lifting his voice. When Raila Amolo Odinga died, a chapter of Kenya's story closed with him. Not just a political life, but a generation's dream of what this country could be if courage could bend power. From Kisumu's dusty childhood lanes to the cold detention cells of Nyayo House, from the roar of campaign crowds to the silence of betrayal, his life was a long, defiant dialogue with destiny. They called him many things: rebel, liberator, traitor, visionary, opportunist. But no matter the name, he was always at the center of Kenya's political conscience. And now, as his body lies buried in the red soils of Bondo, thousands still gather, not just to mourn a man, but to wrestle with the question that refuses to die. Did Raila Odinga change Kenya, or did Kenya break him? This is not a eulogy. This is a trial of history, a search for truth in the shadows of one man's life. I am your narrator. Welcome to Dark Echoes. And this is Raila Odinga, the last revolutionary.
I've been in prison 3 times for a total of 8.5 years. This is detention without trial. In other words, I was never tried and convicted. There used to be a lot of torture, both physical and psychological. Physical, sometimes when they arrested you, they subject you to a lot of beatings. Psychological in the sense that it was solitary confinement. You were completely alone and incommunicado. Correspondences are very rare. Sometimes letters take as long as 6 months to arrive, and no access to any kind of information from the outside world. Initially, they only give you the Bible and the Quran if you ask for it. Those are the 2 materials that you have. Until later, when they relax it and allow your family to send you some really materials. And they can also give you some materials from the prison library.
In the quiet town of Maseno in western Kenya, a child was born beneath the long shadow of history. It was January 7th, 1945, just months before the end of Second World War, when the world was redrawing its power lines and Africa was learning the bitter language of resistance. That child was Raila Amolo Odinga, son of Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, a name already charged with political electricity. He was not born into privilege but into purpose. Raila's childhood was shaped with 2 forces, education and defiance. His father, Jaramogi, was amongst the first generation of educated Africans under colonial rule, a teacher, nationalist, and ultimately one of Kenya's founding fathers. But what he passed to his son wasn't wealth, it was relentlessness of the spirits, a conviction that power must answer to the people. Growing up in the Luo heartland, Raila was surrounded by the echoes of ancestral pride, a people known for their eloquence, resilience, and fire. Yet, even as a boy, he was aware that in the eyes of the colonial states, Africa was still second-class beings. His early education began at Ng'ia Intermediate School and later Maranda High School, both known for discipline and rigorous thought. There, the young Raila learned that intelligence without courage is merely compliance. By 1960s, Kenya stood at the edge of independence, and Jaramogi was one of the loudest voices demanding that the colonial government hand off power to Africa. He turned down the offer to be prime minister under British conditions, insisting that Jomo Kenyatta, then imprisoned, must be freed first. It was a bold and dangerous act, but it made Jaramogi a legend. And in his son's mind, it carved a permanent belief. Some fights aren't worth everything, even isolation. Raila would later join the Herder Institute in Eastern Germany, a nation divided by ideology where socialism and capitalism stared at each other across barbed wires. For a young African student, East Germany was an education not just in engineering but in ideology. He studied mechanical engineering at the Technical School of Magdeburg, a city that had been bombed to dust and rebuilt on revolutionary ideas. There he saw a world defined by struggle, workers against system, truth against propaganda, and those ideas would follow him home like a ghost. When Raila returned to Kenya in the early 1970s, he found a nation no longer under colonial rule but gripped by the new form of power, the independence elites. His father had fallen out with Kenyatta's government, accused of being too radical, too socialist, too outspoken. The Odinga name had become both revered and feared. As for young Raila, it was a lesson in how quickly liberation movements can become instruments of control. He took up a teaching position at the University of Nairobi, later joining the Kenya Bureau of Standards, quietly building his career as an engineer. But under the surface, something was growing, a quiet anger, a sense that the ideals of independence has been betrayed. Corruption was rising, dissent was punished, freedom had turned into private privilege for the few. The dream of Mau Mau had been sold off to the highest bidder. By the late 1970s, the political climate in Kenya was suffocating. Jomo Kenyatta's rule had given way to Daniel Arap Moi, and what began as a promise of unity quickly hardened into a regime of fear. The air was thick with suspicion. People whispered in public places, afraid the government might be listening because it often was. In those years, Raila began moving quietly in the background, talking to the activists, writers, students, leaders, and leftist thinkers. He was drawn to those who believed Kenya could be something better, freer, fairer, and more accountable. But to the state, such conversations were treasonous, and the seed of rebellion were already on the ground. Raila's early adulthood was a blend of technical precision and political fire. He wasn't loud, not yet, but observant, deliberate, and calculating. He'd inherited his father's fearlessness, but added to it is a methodical engineer's mind. While others acted on impulse, Raila planned. He understood that power wasn't just about shouting, it was about strategy. And Kenya was about to test that strategy in the harshest way possible. In 1982, the air around him would ignite into chaos, and Raila Odinga's name would move from the university corridors to the darkest corners of Kenya's prisons. Hold on to that. That's where we'll go next, into the rebellion and detention years, where conviction met brutality and where the man we now call Baba was forged in the fire. Because before Raila became a symbol, he was a son. Watching his father's generation rise, fracture and fall, he learned that loyalty has a cost, that truth often walks alone, and that sometimes the only way to serve your country is to confront it. This was the birth of a rebel.
Round the Bay of Mexico, where the sun shines daily on a mountain top, I took a trip on a sailing ship. When I reached Jamaica, I made a stop, but I'm sad to say I'm on my way. Won't be back for many a days. My head is down, my head is turning around. I had to leave a little girl in Kingston town.
By 1982, Kenya was a nation on edge, a place where silence spoke louder than protests. Daniel Arap Moi had consolidated power, building a one-party state that ran on fear and obedience. Whispers of dissent were treated like poison. The special branch listened, the police watched, and citizens learned that even thinking too loudly could get you vanished. Raila Odinga, then in his late 30s, was no longer the young idealist who'd returned from East Germany full of blueprints and dreams. He was restless, watching a country he loved sink deeper into oppression. He'd seen how power corrodes, how freedom fades, and now hope becomes a crime. He began quietly connecting with reformists, students, soldiers, intellectuals, men and women who believed Kenya needed a reset. They weren't calling for chaos, they were calling for change, but in 1982, change came in the form of gunfire. In the morning of August 1st, 1982, a faction of the Kenya Air Force attempted a coup d'etat. The rebels seized the Voice of Kenya Broadcasting Nation and announced that the government of President Moi had been overthrown. For a few brief hours, Nairobi held its breath, and then the retaliation came, swift, merciless, and absolute. Moi's loyalists crushed the uprising within hours. Hundreds were killed, thousands were arrested, and in the chaos that followed, the government went hunting not just for the soldiers, but for the thinkers, the ones whose ideas had dared to question authority. Raila Odinga's name surfaced. The government accused him of being part of the coup planning, a civilian coordinator, the mind behind the whispers. He was arrested and thrown into detention without trial. The cell was small, airless, and designed to erase a man from himself. Days turned into weeks, then years. He was interrogated, beaten, isolated, denied sunlight, denied speech. The regime wanted confession, repentance, and submission, but Raila refused to break. In detention, something inside him hardened. He began to understand the anatomy of tyranny, not a theory, but as an experience. The loneliness taught him what power fears most: memory. If you remember who you are, no system can truly own you. Outside, his family suffered. His wife, Raila Odinga, faced harassment and surveillance. His children grew up watching their father's name whispered like a ghost in public spaces. For the Odingas, resistance wasn't political, but survival. Raila would be released in 1988 after 6 long years. Gowns changed but unbroken. He'd walk out of prison with the calm stare of a man who had seen death blink fast. But freedom in Moi's Kenya was an illusion. He was rearrested again in 1989, then 1990, accused of subversion, of holding secret meetings, of influencing dangerous ideas. Each time, the government tried to bury him deeper. Each time, he came back stronger. In those cells, Raila learned patience, the kind that outlasts regimes. He memorized the sound of footsteps, the rhythm of interrogations, the small details that tell you when someone's about to hurt you. Psychologists would later call this institutional trauma, but Raila called it preparation, because every blow, every night of silence was training him for something greater, the long game of liberation. To understand Raila's psychology, you must understand the paradox of resistance. He was not a man chasing martyrdom. He wanted reform, not ruin. Yet the state brutally radicalized him. Every injustice fed him conviction that Kenya would only be saved through confrontation. He learned that politics without pain is theater, and pain without purpose is waste. Meanwhile, Kenya was changing. The 1980s saw a growing tide of defiance, from the university protest in Nairobi to the mothers' hunger strike at Uhuru Park. The youth were angry, the intellectual disillusioned, the churches increasingly vocal. The country was simmering, and Raila's name became a quiet symbol of defiance, the one who refused to bow. By 1991, The pressure of Moi's regime was immense. International donors were cutting aid, activists were filling jails, and the one-party system was collapsing under its own paranoia. In that climate, Raila walked out of detention one last time into a Kenya standing at the edge of transformation. He had lost years, friends, and perhaps faith in the system, but he hadn't lost his will to fight.
The king is dead, but long live the crown. Joey! 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 Aluo, Jaramogi's son, Tinga, Agwambo, Nyundo, Jacom, Baba Fidel, Baba.
Raila's time in detention redefined him. He emerged not just as Jaramogi's son, but as his own kind of revolutionary, pragmatic, strategic, and painfully aware of human's frailty. He'd seen how fear manipulates, how power isolates, and how even the bravest can be broken by solitude. But he also learned something rare, the art of endurance. And endurance, not outrage, would become his greatest weapon. When asked years later how prison changed him, Raila said, "I learned that freedom is not given, it's taken, piece by piece, risk by risk." Those years behind bars carved the man Kenya would come to know, not just as politician, but as a survivor of the machinery of control, a man who walked through darkness and learned to read its language. And as the gates of the one-party state began to crack open in the 1990s, Raila Odinga was already standing at the threshold, waiting, watching, and ready to walk through fire again if meant Kenya would breathe free. This wasn't the end of his fight. It was the beginning of the multi-party war, a battle not of bullets but of ballots, alliances, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of democracy that always seemed one election away. When Raila Odinga stepped out of detention in 1991, Kenya was not the same country he had been arrested in. The silence that had once blackened the nation was cracking open. There were whispers of revolt in churches, on campuses, even in the streets of Nairobi. The global tide had shifted. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Autocrats were losing their grip across Africa, and Kenya's one-party rule was beginning to suffocate under its own arrogance. President Daniel Arap Moi, who had ruled since 1978, was facing something new, a generation no longer afraid, and among them was Raila, who had spent years watching from behind prison walls as hope was strangled by fear. He emerged with a clear conviction: if Kenya was to change, it would not be through whispers, but through open confrontation. In December 1991, after massive internal and international pressure, Moi reluctantly repealed Section 2A of the Constitution, ending Kenya's one-party system. The floodgates opened. Old allies turned rivals overnight. New political parties sprang up like wildfire, each promising freedom, democracy, and justice. But beneath the slogan was something far more dangerous: ethnic fragmentation and personal ambition. Raila joined the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy, FORD, a coalition of reformists, veterans, and dreamers. Amongst its founders were his father Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, Kenneth Matiba, Charles Rubia, and other heavyweights who had borne the scars of Moi's rule. It was supposed to be the Great Democratic Front, but like every alliance born in crisis, FORD soon began to splinter. Moi's government, cunning and experienced, played on Kenya's deepest wounds: ethnicity and ego. He didn't have to destroy FORD. He just had to let it destroy itself. Soon, FORD split into two: FORD Kenya, led by Jaramogi, and FORD Asili, led by Kenneth Matiba. The unity that had terrified the regime was gone. In 1992 general election, Kenya's first multi-party poll in 26 years, Moi won again, not by popularity but by division. The opposition's votes scattered amongst rivals. It was a bitter lesson. Kenya's democracy could be legalized, but not yet realized. For Raila, that election marked the beginning of political education in betrayal. He saw how hope could be hijacked by personality, how revolutionary could be reduced by arithmetic. But he didn't quit. He reorganized, built networks, and learned that mechanics of the new political battlefield. When his father Jaramogi passed away in 1994, Raila inherited more than a name. He inherited a mission unfinished. But he also inherited enemies who saw him as a threat to their comfort in the new order. He took over leadership of ODM Kenya, but his push for internal democracy clashed with party elders. Once again, factions rose, and Raila found himself forced out by the same forces that had once stood beside his father. So he made a bold move. In 1996, he resigned from ODM Kenya and announced his candidacy under the National Development Party, NDP, a small, barely known outfit at the time. Most analysts laughed. They said the Odinga flame had burnt out, that Raila would fade into political obscurity. But Raila understood something they didn't. Kenya's politics wasn't just about parties, it was about people, and people remembered courage. He began mobilizing at the grassroots, rallying disillusioned youth, workers, and rural communities who felt abandoned by both Moi's regime and the fractured opposition. He built his message around equality and reform, but also reconciliation, and it worked. By the 1997 general election, Raila, running under NDP, came in third place behind Moi and Mwai Kibaki, a shocking performance for a man leading a minor party. It was political chess at its finest. In the aftermath, Moi saw something few did, that Raila was not just a threat but also a potential ally. The president extended an unexpected olive branch. In 1998, Raila accepted a cooperation deal with Moi's ruling KANU party. The move stunned the nation. Was Raila betraying the struggle, or was he playing a deeper game? Publicly, he justified it as pragmatic alliance, a chance to reform the system from within. Privately, it was a masterclass in infiltration. Raila was learning how power moved, who controlled it, and where it was most vulnerable. He merged NDP with KANU in 2001, becoming a cabinet minister for energy. The same system that had once caged him now welcomed him into inner cycle. But Raila's history with rebellion didn't disappear, it only matured. Inside government, he saw the rot up close, the corruption, the patronage, the tribal politics dressed as national unity, and when the time came, he struck.
Ati wanakano ni wajinga na werevu hawana. Wanakano ni wajinga na werevu hawana. Ukiona ukelewa usidhani ni tajiri. Hiyo ni mali ya umma wameiba toka kwenu jame. Wape hiyo pombe yao. Wakileo wakitapika ni shauri yao.
As the 2002 elections approached, Moi made a fatal miscalculation. He bypassed Raila and other KANU veterans to endorse Uhuru Kenyatta, a political novice, a son of the first president, as his chosen successor. To Raila, it was a deja vu, history repeating itself, the old dynasties tightening their grip on Kenya's future. He refused to accept it. Raila and several high-ranking ministers, amongst them Kalonzo Musyoka, George Saitoti, William Ole Ntimama, rebelled. They formed the Rainbow Alliance, which later merged with Mwai Kibaki's Democratic Party and Charity Ngilu's NARC to create a new super coalition. It was the first time Kenya's opposition truly united behind one cause, ending Moi's 24-year rule. In 2002, campaign was electric. Raila fiery slogan, Kibaki Tosha, became a national rallying cry. In that moment, Raila wasn't just endorsing Kibaki, he was baptizing him politically. And the people believed. When the results came in, the unthinkable happened. Moi's KANU was defeated. Kenya erupted in celebration. For the first time in its history, Power had changed hands peacefully through the ballots, and at the heart of that victory stood Raila, the man who had been jailed, beaten, exiled from his own party, now crowned as the architect of a democratic transition. But every revolution has its aftermath, and as the dust settled, the alliance that brought freedom would soon crumble under the weight of ambition, because Kenya had won democracy, but the war for its soul had just begun. Next came the reform years, the chapter where victory turned to betrayal, and Raila's dream of a new Kenya collided head-on with old ghosts of power. Kenya in 2003 was euphoric. After 24 years of Daniel Arap Moi, the air itself felt new. Everywhere there was the sound of hope, horns blaring, people dancing in dusty streets, strangers hugging. For once, the word change didn't feel like a lie. And at the center of that new dawn stood Raila Amolo Odinga, the man many believed had finally broken the back of dictatorship. When the National Rainbow Coalition knocked to power, Mwai Kibaki became president and Raila was appointed Minister of Roads, Public Works and Housing. The handshake that had sealed the alliance Kibaki Tosha was still fresh in everyone's mind, but the euphoria didn't last. Power once again began to distort everything. Behind the smiles and photo ops, a storm brewed quietly. The now coalition had been built on a promise, a written memorandum of understanding, that after winning, the presidency would rotate and a prime minister position would be created for Raila. But once Kibaki settled into State House, that document vanished like mist. Cabinet appointments favored his inner circles. Raila allies were sidelined. The revolution had been televised and then conveniently forgotten. Raila, who had fought governments from the outside, now faced betrayal from within. He began to speak out, accusing the Kibaki administration of arrogance, corruption, and tribal favorism. The man who had helped bring Kibaki to power was now being painted as impatient, power-hungry, even dangerous. But history has taught him something crucial. Silence is surrender, so he didn't stay quiet. By 2005, the rift had widened into a canyon. Kenya was prepared for constitutional referendum, a chance to reshape the nation's political system once and for all. The draft constitution, backed by Kibaki's government, was criticized for centralizing power in the presidency, the very structure Raila had spent decades fighting. He led the opposition campaign under the orange banner, symbolizing those who rejected the draft. Those who supported it became known as the bananas. It was a battle not just of symbols but of ideologies. When the referendum results came in, the orange side won. It was a stunning rebuke to the sitting president, a moment of defiance that reshaped the political map. The Orange movement evolved into the Orange Democratic Movement, ODM, and Raila emerged as its undisputed leader. He was no longer the rebel at the gate, he was now the voice of the people who felt betrayed by their own liberation. But Kenya's politics has always been a game of proximity to power, and no victory goes unpunished. The 2007 general election became one of the most divisive in Kenya's history. Raila faced off against Kibaki, this time not as an ally but as a rival. The campaign was intense, emotional, and tribal tension ran deep. When the results were announced, Kibaki was declared the winner under questionable circumstances. The reaction was instantaneous. Kenya banned. The 2007-2008 post-election violence left over 1,000 people dead and hundreds of thousands displaced. The country that had prided itself as a beacon of stability in East Africa was tearing itself apart. And in the middle of the chaos stood Raila, accusing the government of electoral theft while calling for calm. The world watched in horror. It took international mediation led by Kofi Annan to stop the bloodshed. The result was a coalition government, an easy peace stitched together by necessity. Kibaki remained president, Raila was sworn in as Kenya's second prime minister, a position created to balance power between the two sides. It was an unprecedented political experiment, co-leadership in a nation still bleeding from ethnic wounds. Raila approached this new role with energy and reformist zeal. He pushed for infrastructure revival, anti-corruption measures, and the completion of long-stalled projects. Under his watch, Kenya saw the modernization of roads, renewed attention to housing, and the early frameworks that would later become the Vision 2030 Development Plan. But inside government, the rivalry with Kibaki's camp continued to fester. Every policy was politicized, every initiative reduced to a contest of loyalty. Still, Raila's presence in power marked a turning point. He proved that opposition could be institutionalized, that they could be part of the system without being consumed by it. His leadership style was participatory, often populist, grounded in town hall, political, grassroots dialogues. He was not a technocrat, he was a mobilizer, a man who would turn policy into poetry and poetry into movement. In 2010, a new constitution of Kenya was finally promulgated, a document that decentralized power, strengthened the judiciary, and refined the presidency. It was the realization of a dream that men like Jaramogi and Raila had been imprisoned for. Even Kibaki allies quietly admitted that without Raila's relentless pressure, the reform process would have stalled indefinitely. But history is cruel to reformers. Their victory are often stolen by those who survived them. As the 2013 election approached, the coalition era came to an end. Kibaki was retiring and the field was open. Raila, carrying the ODM banner, stood against Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, who had formed the Jubilee Alliance after facing charges at the International Criminal Court over the 2007 election violence. Raila's campaign promised unity, industrial growth, and constitutional fidelity, but the odds were stacked against him. When the results came in, Uhuru was declared winner. Raila contested the outcome in court, a move that showcased his respect for legal process over chaos. When the Supreme Court upheld Uhuru's victory, Raila accepted the verdict, saying, "While I disagree with it, I respect it." It was a statesman's movement, quite undignified, a reminder that his war was never with the ballot, but with injustice. The reform years tested Raila in ways prison never could. They stripped him of illusions, forced him to confront human greed, and showed him that winning power was not the same as wielding it justly. He emerged from the decades older, wiser, and scarred, but not defeated. Because Raila's life has never been about comfort. It has always been about continuity, taking the torch, however dim, and keeping it alive in the wind. Even his enemies admitted that he was relentless, unyielding, a man who refused to bow to the architecture of impunity. And as the decade closed, Kenya was preparing for yet another showdown. The battlefield would be digital, the alliance even more unpredictable, and the stakes nothing less of legacy itself. By 2017, Kenya had seen enough of Raila Odinga to know that he was no ordinary politician. He wasn't a businessman chasing contracts, nor a dynasty preserving wealth. He was a man chasing history. But history has never been kind to men who stand too close to power without holding it. This was his fourth run for the presidency and perhaps his last attempt to finish the journey his father began. The campaign was fierce, personal, and polarized. The ruling Jubilee Party, led by Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto, had money, machinery, and state influence. Raila's NASA coalition, the National Super Alliance, had passion, numbers, and belief. For his supporters, Raila was not just a candidate, he was a symbol of unfinished business. To them, 2007 had never been resolved, it was merely postponed. When the August 2017 election results were announced, the shock felt familiar. Uhuru Kenyatta was declared the winner with 54% of the vote. Raila rejected the outcome, calling it a sham. He claimed the election was hacked, the results were manipulated, and that Kenya's democracy had been hijacked by a logarithm and state operatives. Then came a moment unprecedented in African history. The Supreme Court annulled the presidential election, citing massive irregularities. It was the first time in the continent's history that a court had nullified a presidential win. Raila supporters flooded the streets, dancing and crying for once justice had teeth. But the victory was short-lived. When the repeat election was held in October 2017, Raila withdrew, accusing the Electoral Commission of refusing to implement meaningful reforms. The rerun went ahead with the low voter turnout, and Uhuru was sworn in once again. To many, Raila's political career looked over. To others, it was just another chapter in a saga that refused to end. Then came January 30th, 2018, a day that turned defiance into theater. At Uhuru Park, surrounded by tens of thousands of supporters, Raila swore himself in as the people's president. The government blacked out TV stations, arrested opposition figures, and declared the act treasonous. For a brief moment, it seemed Kenya was on the edge of another national crisis, but what happened next stunned everyone. On March 9th, 2018, Raila Odinga and Uhuru Kenyatta appeared together on the steps of Nyayo House. They shook hands, a gesture that would be known as the handshake. Two men who had fought bitterly for power now stood side by side, speaking of unity, reconciliation, and a new Kenya. For a country exhausted by endless elections, it looked like peace, but beneath that calm, confusion reigned. To Raila's loyalists, it felt like betrayal. For years, they had marched, bled, and faced police batons, believing they were part of the revolution. Now, their leader had made peace with the very system they thought he was fighting. Was this forgiveness or surrender? Raila explained it as strategic reconciliation, a way to heal the country and push forward long-delayed reforms. Together with Uhuru, he launched the Building Bridge Initiative, BBI, a project meant to address ethnic division, corruption, and electoral injustice. Its goals were noble on paper but politically explosive. BBI proposed expanding the executive, introducing a prime minister's post, deputy prime minister, and a broader power-sharing model. Critics saw it as a backdoor attempt to extend political lifeline for elites. Supporters saw it as Kenya's best chance at lasting peace. As Raila crisscrossed the countries defending BBI, his tone shifted. He spoke less of an opposition leader and more like a statesman, patient, pragmatic, almost paternal. He argued that Kenya cannot move forward through revenge, but many in his base couldn't shake the feeling that their general had laid down his sword before the war was done. Meanwhile, the political marriage between Uhuru and Ruto collapsed. The deputy president accused Raila of infiltrating Jubilee and dismantling it from within. To Raila, it was poetic justice. The same government that had once ridiculed him was now fracturing under his influence. He had become the calm in the center of the storm, the man both feared and needed. But power never sits still. As the 2022 election approached, the handshake that had begun as a symbol of unity turned into a weapon of division. Uhuru openly endorsed Raila as his preferred successor, a move that shocked the political class and enraged Ruto's faction. Suddenly, Raila had eternal outsider was now the established candidate. The rebel had become the system. His campaign message focused on stability, infrastructure, and generational transition. He promised an inclusive government, Baba's last dance, as some called it. But the mood on the ground had changed. The cost of living was high, corruption scandals had multiplied, and young voters felt abandoned by both sides. Ruto positioned himself as the hustler, the outsider, flipping Raila's old script against him. It was a masterstroke of narrative politics. When the 2002 results came in, William Ruto was declared president. Raila rejected the outcome, again citing irregularities, but the Supreme Court upheld the victory. At 77 years, the man who had spent nearly his entire adult life fighting for Kenya's democracy had been denied the presidency once more. But he didn't burn the country. He didn't call for war. He simply said, "We shall fight another day." And maybe that was the point. Raila Odinga's story has never been about sitting in State House. It was about keeping the idea of justice alive long enough for someone else to inherit it. He had become the country's moral opposition, a conscience too loud to be silenced. too soft to be feared. The handshake years were not about victory. They were about evolution. They taught Kenya that peace can sometimes look like compromise, and that in politics, betrayal is just another language of survival. In the end, Raila walked a path that very few could. He had dined with his enemies, mourned his friends, and buried his father's dreams only to resurrect them again. He had become part of Kenya's collective psychology, the archetype of the resilient loser who somehow still commands respect. Because in a nation where politics often feels like theater, Raila was one both actor and audience, director and script. And even after the final act, the crowd still waits, wondering if the curtain will rise once more. Every man spends his life trying to outlive his father's shadow. For Raila Amolo Odinga, that shadow was colossal. His father, Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, had been the country's first vice president, a man who defied power, challenged colonial authority, and paid for it with political exile. From childhood, Raila watched what rebellion costs. He saw what happens when truth clashes with the establishment, the friends who vanish, the world that evaporates, the loneliness that lingers after applause fades. That legacy became his inheritance, not land, not fortune, but defiance. And in that inheritance, he found both purpose and curse. By the time Raila entered his late years, he had become less of a man and more of a symbol. Baba, the father figure of the opposition, the enduring reminder that democracy in Kenya was built on bruises. He was the man you loved or hated but could never ignore. Across the years, he learned the art of surviving politically engineered humiliation. He had been detained, betrayed, mocked, and beaten, but every time he rose. To many, that resilience became mythic. It was no longer about whether Raila would be president, it was about whether he could be broken. And time and again, the answer was no. Yet, behind the public defiance was a private exhaustion. The weight of always being the alternative, the constant burden of being called to fix a nation that refused to change, to the conscience in a room that preferred silence, to the man who everyone quoted but few truly followed. In political psychology, this is called hero fatigue, when a leader becomes so synonymous with struggle that people subconsciously crave his failure just to see the story end. For Raila, the fatigue came not from the people, but from the endless loop of Kenya's political culture, the tribal alliance, the rigged system, the betrayal of ideals for survival. He had fought it for decades, but even heroes get tired of reputation. Still, he never fully stepped away. Even in defeat, Raila remained an institution, attending national prayers, mediating crises, mentoring young leaders. He was no longer the agitator throwing stones in the streets. He had become the old lion watching from the hill, growling only when provoked. To his opponents, he was a man who couldn't let go of the dream that Kenya owed him a throne. To his supporters, he was the moral spine of republic, the one who could be trusted to speak when others whispered. Both sides were right. His legacy sits on a double edge. One side cared for courage, the other from controversy. He stood for democracy but also made peace with those who once silenced it. He was visionary and pragmatic, revolutionary and establishment. Contradiction that made him above all human. In Kenya's culture, especially amongst the Luo, legacy is sacred. A man's name is not just what he is called, it is what his descendants must defend. And the Odinga's name carries weight, the kind of weight that bends generation. His children, his family, his allies all move beneath his pressure. Because when your father builds the road of rebellion, you don't walk quietly, you march even when you are bleeding. And Raila's life, for all its victories and defeats, has been a march, not towards a palace, but towards remembrance. He may never have won the crown, but he became something rare, a permanent character in Kenya's national story. When history is written, every president will be mentioned, but Raila will be studied. Culturally, he redefined what opposition meant. He taught a generation that resistance is not a one-time event, it's a lifestyle. He gave people language to express dissent without shame. He normalized protest as patriotism, anger as participation. And politically, he shaped the modern Kenya psyche, a mix of hope, suspicion, and defiance. Even those who disagree with him now use his methods, his vocabulary, his blueprint. Every political movement born after him borrows from his templates: mass mobilization, ethnic coalition, moral rhetoric. Even his rivals mirror his tone. His critics say he failed because he never became president, but that's a narrow measure of success. History is not written by winners, it's written by the unforgettable. And few men in Africa post-colonial era has been as unforgettable as Raila Odinga. Let's be honest. When he finally passed, Kenya did not just lose a politician, it lost an idea. The streets went silent, the flags dropped to half-masts, and suddenly, the noise of politics felt small. For decades, he had been the storm. Now there was only the echo. In his eulogy, one of his closest allies said, "Raila was not perfect, but in a nation built on fear, he taught us how to speak." And that perhaps is the truth weight of his legacy. He made courage a language. He turned loss into loyalty. He taught Kenyans that rebellion, when done with conscience, is not chaos, it's progress. So when they speak of him now, it's not in whispers but in reverence. They say his name the way one says the name of a storm that changed the shape of a coast. When the news broke, it didn't sound real. Raila Odinga is dead. The sentence hung in the air like smoke. For a moment, the country paused, as if the nation itself had forgotten how to breathe. It wasn't just that a man had died, it was that a presence, one that had defied every election, every protest, every public debate for nearly half a century, was suddenly gone. Even his fiercest critics admitted it. Kenya without Raila felt incomplete, like a sentence missing in a final word. Flags flew at half-mast. The streets of Kisumu flooded with mourners, thousands dressed in white, waving palm branches, carrying portraits of a man who for decades had stood where many feared to stand. From Nairobi to Homa Bay, church bells told the songs of freedom echoed once again. It felt like a funeral and more like the final rally, one last gathering of people who had followed him through every heartbreak and rebirth. At Kango, Jaramogi, the Odinga homestead in Bondo, the ancestral grounds were transformed into a sea of humanity. Leaders from across the continent arrived, presidents, former foes, and old allies. They stood shoulder to shoulder, united not by politics but by the weight of the moment. Even those who once plotted against him came to pay respects because in death, Raila had achieved what politics never allowed: unanimous recognition. The funeral wasn't loud, it was dignified, deliberate, and deeply spiritual. Priests spoke of forgiveness, musicians sang of resilience, and when Mama Ida, his long-life companion, rose to speak, the crowd went silent. Her voice was steady but soaked in decades of unspoken struggle. "He was never just mine," she said softly. "He belonged to all of you, to every dreamer who refused to bow." As his casket was lowered beside his father, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Like father, like son, father and son, two generations of rebellion finally resting side by side. It was as if history has closed its own loop. The cameras panned over the lake, still endless and quietly mournful. In Luo culture, water is memory. It holds what the land cannot. And that day, Lake Victoria seemed to shimmer with something sacred, as though the ancestors themselves had come to welcome him home. But death did not silence Raila Odinga. In fact, it amplified him. Within hours, murals appeared across the country. Raila's face painted alongside the words, "Freedom is never free." Online, his speeches resurfaced, his warnings about corruption, his plea for justice, his unshaken faith that Kenya could still heal itself for a new generation. Raila was no longer just a politician, he was a moral compass, a cultural myth reborn in digital form. And maybe that was always the destiny of a man who never truly won power, to instead win performance. His life had been a study in contradiction, victories that felt like losses, losses that became legends. He had lived long enough to see enemies become allies and allies become strangers. But through it all, he never lost his belief that truth, no matter how delayed, would outlast deceit. When historians write on this era, they will speak of Kenya's flawed elections, its ethnic fractures, its endless cycles of reform. But in between those lines, they will speak of one man who carried a nation's anger and still preached peace, who could have taken revenge but chose resilience, who despite being broken by system never stopped believing in people. And that's where his story ends, not with power seized but with purpose fulfilled. Because Raila Odinga was never meant to be a king. He was meant to be a keeper of ideals, of memories, of courage, the kind of man whose absence reminds us of what leadership once looked like before greed took over the vocabulary of politics. As the sun sets over Bondo that evening, an old fisherman was overheard telling a young boy, "We have buried a man, yes, but we have not buried his voice." And in that simple sentence lies the truth of Raila's legacy, that movement don't die with their leaders. They dissolve into the people, into the rhythm of their lives, into the quiet courage that whispers, "We still have work to do." When the credits of his life roll and the headlines fade, one truth still remains. Kenya will forever be divided before and after Raila Odinga, because he didn't just fight for democracy, he became its living evidence. So when future generations ask who he was, tell them this: he was not perfect, he was not always right, but he was necessary. He made us argue, think, march, hope, and demand more from our country. He reminded us that freedom is not a gift, it's a discipline. And in that, Raila Odinga didn't just change Kenya, he defined it. We are all humans, and so was Raila Odinga. He made mistakes, he made enemies, he misjudged moments, but those things never erased what he stood for or what he gave. For decades, he placed his life on the line so others could speak freely, vote freely, live freely. He faced jail cells, betrayal, and exiles, yet kept walking towards the same dream, a Kenya that belonged to everyone, not just a chosen few. He loved his country in ways that defied reasons. Even when the same people he fought for turned their backs, even when hate came dressed as politics, he stayed. He loved deeply, including those who despised him simply for being a Luo, because for him, Kenya was bigger than tribe, bigger than power, bigger than pain. Raila was not perfect, but perfection was never the point. He was the reminder that democracy is not born in peace, but in struggle. That freedom is not handed down, it is wrestled into existence for those who refuse to bow. And in his final years, when the noise faded and the slogans grew old, what remained was something simple: a man, weary but unbroken, who believed Kenya could be better. In death, Raila Odinga became what time could never erase, a chapter written in sacrifice, inked in resilience, sealed in history, because nations are not built by saints, they are built by humans, flawed, stubborn, hopeful, who choose to fight anyway. And in that, Raila chose right.